wanderers. This is Benz from Off the Map Gaming. Today, I will be reading The Thing, from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, Volume 1. A story about two best friends, a thing they found, and the consequences of their curiosity. Make sure to turn off all the lights and get comfortable under the covers, but I can't guarantee that will stop the monster from finding its way into your house. Ted Martin and Sam Miller were good friends. They spent a lot of time together. On this particular night, they were sitting on a fence near a post office, talking about one thing and another. There was a field of turnips across the road. Surprisingly, they saw something crawl out of the field and stand up. It looked like a man, but in the dark, it was hard to tell for sure. As quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. But soon, it appeared again. It walked halfway across the road, then turned around and returned to the field. Then it came for a third time and started toward them. By now, Ted and Sam were scared and they started running. But when they finally stopped, they decided that they were being silly and childish. They weren't so sure what had scared them, so they decided to go back and get a better look. Pretty soon, they saw it, for it was coming to meet them. It was wearing black pants, a white shirt, and black suspenders. Ted said, "I think I'm going to try and touch it. Then we'll know if it's real." He courageously walked up to it and peered into its face. It had bright, penetrating eyes that sunk deep into its head. It looked almost like a skeleton. Ted took one look and screamed, and again he and Sam ran, but the corpse-like figure followed them. When they got to Ted's house, they stood in the doorway and watched it, appalled. It stayed out on the road for a while, seeming to watch them in return, but once more it vanished. No more than a year later, Ted grew horribly ill, and the sickness killed him. Toward the end, Sam sat up with him every night. The night Ted died, he looked just like the frightening thing that they had encountered a year before. And that's the end of the story, or as far as most remember. But the devil is in the details. The night that Ted died, he looked just like the thing they had seen a year before. Ted's sickness had started 6 months after the meeting with the thing. He grew weak and feverish. Ted would lie in bed, making the bed moist with sweat, but he would still shiver from his fever. His face was a mass of pain, his eyes shut tight to fight back the nausea that racked his stomach. Sam came by every day of the week to check in on his friend and give him the homework that their teachers had assigned them. Ted did his best to complete the homework, but the pain was too much, and after only a week, Sam stopped bringing it to him. After a month, Ted's skin started to look pale, and he secreted horrible odors that were offensive to those that came to visit him. He washed every day and joked that the sickness was giving him nervous farts. Sam laughed at that and said, "It's not much worse than how you usually smell anyways." And they laughed together. In the second month, Ted started to gain weight. He grew a second chin, and his torso and limbs began bloating. Sam mentioned that they should go work out once Ted was healthy again. "Yeah, you definitely look like you need to go back to the gym," Ted replied with a grin, and they laughed. Another month rolled by, and just as quickly as he had begun to gain weight, he started to lose it. Ted's flesh sagged and wrinkled as it threatened to slide right off his arms. The skin on his face, however, stretched over his skull in an unnatural way. Not unlike if he were wearing another person's face, as a mask over his own. His eyes sunk deep into the back of his head, making 2 black pits where his eyes had been.
I'm getting lucky this year,
Ted said.
I look like a skeleton, just in time for Halloween.
And Ted gave a wheezing, coughing laugh. Sam chuckled, but they both knew it wasn't genuine. November came, and Ted's skin started to grow black spots, and his hair began to fall out. The spots started near his mouth, and slowly the flesh around his lips decayed and melted away, showing only his teeth. Ted had tubes and wires hooked up all over his body, pumping IV solution into his veins, monitoring his breathing and heart rate. Ted did not have much energy those days. Most of the time, Sam would come in, sit down, and talk about what was happening in his life. He didn't laugh very much. In December, the doctors found it necessary to perform an MRI scan to examine Ted's brain. He was barely responsive when someone was talking, and his heart rate had slowed to a disturbing degree. There was a large amount of decay. Portions of his brain seemed to be melting, and it baffled the doctors how he was even able to continue to survive. They estimated Ted had 1 week left to live. When Sam heard this news, he stayed by his friend's side every chance he had, and cried. In January, Ted twitched. When Sam first saw this, he thought that Ted was finally going into his death throes, something the doctors had warned him about. Sam's eyes filled with tears, but he forced himself to watch as his friend's body thrashed around in his hospital bed, knocking over IV drips and monitoring equipment. When Ted's body finally stopped whipping its limbs around, Sam buried his face in his hands and wept openly. Sam heard a noise like a monster growling out a low groan. He looked up from his chair, but Ted's body lay still on the bed. Is that what it sounds like when someone's soul leaves their body? Sam asked. He buried his face in his hands once again. As he sat there, feeling the loss of his closest friend, he heard a creak that sent shivers down his spine. As he looked up, he saw his friend's body standing from the bed. A clean scalpel glistened in its right hand. His body leaned off to the right, as if he had a limp. He took 1 staggered step towards Sam. No, please, Ted!" Sam cried out. Ted took another small step towards Sam, and his teeth chattered. Looking into Ted's pit-like eyes, Sam didn't see anything that he recognized. This wasn't his friend. This was some thing. The thing flipped the scalpel around in its hand and raised it above its head. Sam stood up, screamed, and grabbed the chair he was sitting on. He threw it at the thing with all the force he could muster, but the thing caught it with an outstretched hand. Sam was filled with panic as he grabbed the other visitor's chair and ran by while the thing brought the scalpel down. Sam caught the blow with the chair, and the force caused him to stumble into the wall. The thing stepped closer to him again. Sam ducked as he scrambled past it, but the monster whipped the scalpel around faster than Sam would have thought possible. He felt a burning pain cut into his arm as he sprinted by. He felt blood leak from his arm, hot and sticky, as he clutched to stop the bleeding, but he had made it to the door. He yanked the door open and ran into the hallway. He screamed for help, and a nurse came running out of a nearby room. Sam kept a tight hold on his arm as he moved down the hall. Behind him, he could hear the thing's teeth chattering as it limped out of the room. The nurse intercepted Sam and took his arm into her hands. Sam tried to pry her off his arm to get her to let go and urged her to run, but her grip was like iron and she was set on inspecting the wound. She heard the thing's teeth chatter. She looked up from Sam's arm to see it limp out of its room and started stalking toward her with its teeth bared into a horrifying smile. The nurse screamed and freed Sam's arm as he escaped down the hall, wrapping his arm in his shirt in an attempt to stop the bleeding. He could faintly hear the nurse screaming, but he didn't look back. A second later, he was glad he didn't. He heard 3 quick pounds on the tile floor, and then a squishing sound, followed by silence, save for the clicking of his own feet, hurrying towards the exit. He made it to the front waiting room of the hospital. A male nurse was sitting behind the counter. He was already on his feet by the time the bloody teenager ran in. "What the hell is going on?" he yelled, but Sam didn't stop. He could still hear the chattering sound like bones being dropped into a pile. The nurse ran out from behind the counter and started after Sam, but then he heard that sound. He looked to the right and opened his mouth to cry out for help, but he never got the chance. In front of the hospital, Sam ran through the parking lot, but he was out of breath and almost out of blood. That thing must have hit something vital. He was slowing now. He could feel it. He chanced to glance behind him. Had he lost it? Will it stay in the hospital to kill everyone in there instead of him? Was that better? But no. The thing stumbled out of the hospital, much faster than when it had first awoken, and it was gaining quickly. He pushed his body as hard as he could. He looked to the left and saw a small brown car, and started running towards it. He'd feel better if there was something between him and the thing. He almost made it. He ducked his head and started to dive behind the car when he felt a sharp pain in his shoulder of his bad arm. He crashed onto the pavement. As his back struck the ground, he felt the pain in his shoulder again. Whatever had hit him had stuck. He rose to his knees, using his good arm to support him. He felt into the back of his shoulder and found the scalpel that Ted had been using. He yanked it out, the only weapon that he had, and looked over his shoulder to find the thing limping closer. His eyes grew wide as he saw it standing over him. It raised one foot and kicked Sam in the stomach. Sam rolled several feet away and landed on his back. The kick forced the air out of him, and he was struggling to regain his breath. The thing staggered over. His gait was slow, like when he first rose from the hospital bed. A facade, Sam realized. It only acted slow until now. It stumbled to the other side of Sam, and again kicked him back towards the car. Sam's face was bloody and bruised with a swollen eyeball and a broken nose. He could barely keep focus due to the blood loss and what was probably a concussion. He looked up to see the thing's silhouette in front of a full moon. He didn't have the strength to cry out or ask why this had happened. The creature raised its foot once more, in a motion like he was going to stomp on Sam's head. Sam mustered up all the remaining strength he had and wrenched his head to the side as the monster's foot came down with a thud onto the concrete. Sam rose to one leg and cried out as he plunged the scalpel through the side of the creature's knee, causing its leg to buckle and collapse to the ground in a heap. It was still snarling and reaching out to grab him. Sam, breathing heavily, moved to stand over the thing, but stayed just out of reach. He could only see it out of one eye, since the other was swollen shut. He wiped the blood out of his good eye and peered down at the thing. He could see its hideous face in the light of the full moon, and he realized that he had seen it somewhere before. He remembered the thing Ted and him saw a year ago. He blanched at the idea that Ted's sickness might be contagious. Before he could worry about that, he had to deal with this thing. He remembered all the times he and Ted had together, too many to count. He looked down at the thing and said, "Ted's already gone." He steeled himself and took the scalpel in both hands, holding it like a ceremonial blade in front of him. dropping to one knee and plunging the blade into the thing's neck with one final grunt. The thing gurgled, but continued to reach out its hand. It grasped onto Sam's ankle, but it was weak. A teardrop fell from Sam's face as it chattered one last time. He whispered, "I'll see you later, bud." And that's the story of Ted and Sam. One that can chill your bones. I'd like to give mention to Monster Music for creating the ambient soundtrack that was playing during the story. I hope that you stick around next week for the story about a woman who's just trying to leave an evil place. But for now, I hope that you all have a good night, and don't let the thing bite.